Rain hammered the porch roof the night my husband handed me a garbage bag instead of an umbrella. 20 years of marriage and Aaron stood in the doorway of the house I had scrubbed, painted, and prayed and looking at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd overstayed a visit. His mother's ashes weren't even cold in the ground. "I only needed you to take care of my mother," he said, calm as a man reading a grocery list. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a bad joke. He didn't. He told me to pack. He told me not to expect anything. I want to tell you how I got there standing on my own front steps with a suitcase and no coat, because it didn't happen in one night. It happened over 3 years, one small erosion at a time, the way a riverbank disappears without anyone noticing until the house built on it starts to lean. My name is Rachel Nelson. I'm 45 years old, and until 3 years ago, I taught 3rd grade at Maple Hill Elementary. I loved that job with the kind of love that never expected anything in return. The smell of freshly sharpened pencils, the sound of 26 children reciting the alphabet completely out of tune, and the way a shy student's face would light up the moment they finally understood long division. I left that job the year my mother-in-law, Evelyn, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Erin told me she needed someone she trusted, someone patient who wouldn't send her to a nursing home like she was a piece of old furniture no one wanted anymore. He promised it would only be temporary. He promised we'd hire professional help eventually. That eventually never came. So I walked away from my classroom, my students, and a grade book that still had November's spelling scores waiting to be finished. I became Evelyn's full-time caregiver. I learned to cut her food into tiny pieces so she wouldn't choke. I memorized the exact routine of her physical therapy exercises, the gentle tone of voice that kept her calm, and the old songs from the 1960s that could bring her back whenever her memories drifted away. Some days she looked at me and called me by her sister's name, a woman who had passed away more than 30 years earlier. Other days she couldn't even recognize her own son when he walked through the front door, at least not for the first few minutes, but she always recognized me, always. Even on her hardest days, when Alzheimer's had stolen almost everything else, she still knew I was someone who made her feel safe. Meanwhile, Aaron's career kept moving upward. He was a sales director for a medical device company, the kind of man who measured success by quarterly sales numbers and expensive dinners with executives. He was excellent at making connections, wearing the perfect suit, and looking successful wherever he went. Our neighbors admired him. They believed he was a wonderful son for keeping his mother out of a nursing home. What they didn't know was that I hadn't enjoyed a full night's sleep in 3 years. They didn't know I hadn't been to a movie theater, gone out with friends, or even bought myself a new winter coat, because every extra dollar and every spare hour was devoted to caring for a woman who wasn't even my own mother. I never resented Evelyn, I want to make that clear. I loved her in the quiet, unexpected way you come to love someone you've cared for through their most difficult days. The person I slowly began to resent was Aaron, not only because he was rarely home, although that was true too. Business trips lasted longer than necessary, and work dinners became excuses to stay away. It was something deeper than physical absence. He stopped asking how I was doing because he had already decided my answer didn't matter. On the rare nights he was home, I would lie awake beside him, listening to him breathe, wondering when our marriage had quietly turned into 2 strangers simply sharing the same address. I never confronted him. I convinced myself it wasn't the right time. Evelyn needed stability, and I couldn't risk falling apart while she still depended on us, even if, in reality, us had become mostly just me. Looking back now, I think a small, quiet part of me already knew exactly how this story was going to end. You don't spend 3 years being someone's unpaid nurse and unpaid wife without a certain numbness setting in, a bracing for the moment the other shoe drops. I just didn't expect the shoe to drop the same week we buried his mother. I didn't expect him to wait until the flowers on her grave hadn't even wilted before he told me flatly that my usefulness had an expiration date, but that's exactly what happened. And that's where I have to take you back to the porch. The rain, the garbage bag in his hand instead of an umbrella, and the words that ended 20 years in 11 seconds. I stood there in the downpour soaked through before I even reached the sidewalk, and I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I didn't scream. I didn't beg him to reconsider. I just picked up my suitcase and walked, because some part of me, some part that had been quietly gathering evidence for 3 years, already knew I wasn't losing a home that night. I was finally leaving one I'd never really had. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached the end of the driveway, a text from a number I didn't recognize. Rachel, don't leave town. Evelyn left something only for you. 3 weeks before Evelyn died, she had one of those rare mornings where the fog lifted almost completely, and for a few hours she was entirely herself again. I remember it so clearly because those mornings had become so few and far between that I'd learned to treasure them the way you treasure the last warm days before winter. I was reading to her from an old paperback of Little Women, one of her favorites from childhood, when she reached over and put her hand on mine. Her grip was thin but steady. Rachel, she said, and there was nothing hazy in the way she said my name. No hesitation, no searching, promise me something. I set the book down and told her anything. She looked at me with eyes that seemed for that 1 hour entirely clear. Promise me you'll never let Aaron decide your worth. I laughed it off gently, the way you do with someone whose mind drifts in and out, and told her not to worry about things like that. She squeezed my hand harder. I mean it, she said. I've watched him, he's my son and I love him, but I've watched him treat you like hired help for 3 years and I won't say it again, so listen now. Don't let him decide what you're worth. Then, as quickly as the clarity had come, it began to slip. And within the hour, she was calling me by her sister's name again, asking if I'd fed the chickens on their old farm in Ohio, a place that hadn't existed in 60 years. I didn't understand not then how much weight was in that sentence. I filed it away as one of Evelyn's lucid moments, touching, but confusing, the kind of thing dementia patients say that sounds profound because we want it to mean something. I had no idea she'd spent the 2 years prior sitting across a desk from a lawyer named Grace Morgan, rewriting the entire architecture of her estate in absolute secrecy. During those final weeks, Aaron grew more distant than I'd ever known him to be. He was traveling constantly, or claiming to be. His phone, which used to sit face down on the kitchen counter, started staying in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his chest at dinner. At which point he'd excuse himself to the garage to take a work call. I noticed the name Melissa appearing on his lock screen more than once. Melissa Carter, a colleague from his office, someone I'd met exactly twice at company holiday parties. Someone who always smiled at me a beat too long, like she was calculating something. I noticed. I want to be honest with you. I noticed and I said nothing. I didn't check his phone. I didn't follow him to the garage and press my ear to the door. I told myself I was too tired to fight, too consumed with turning Evelyn every 2 hours so she wouldn't develop bed sores. Too depleted to have the kind of confrontation that would blow apart whatever thin structure was still holding our house together. Some women would call that weakness. I call it survival triage. You can only carry so much weight before you have to set something down, and I chose for those final weeks to set down my suspicion so I could carry Evelyn instead. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring with the window cracked open, because she'd always loved the smell of rain, and with my hand wrapped around hers exactly the way it had been for 3 years. Of mornings. She didn't struggle, her breathing simply slowed, then stopped like a tide going out for the last time. I sat with her for almost 20 minutes before I called anyone, because I wasn't ready to let the world back into the room yet. When Aaron finally arrived 45 minutes after I called him, still smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his mother's body with an expression I can only describe as inconvenienced. No tears, no collapse, just a long exhale like a man relieved of a scheduling conflict. I told myself grief looks different on everyone. I told myself he was in shock. But something in me, some quiet observer who'd been watching our marriage from a slight distance for years, now filed that moment away too, next to the phone buzzing against his chest. Next to the business trips that didn't quite add up, next to Evelyn's hand gripping mine with a strength that shouldn't have still been in her. The funeral was small, dignified, exactly the kind of understated affair Evelyn would have wanted. Aaron gave a short, polished eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd read about grief rather than felt it. Neighbors offered casseroles and condolences. I stood at the graveside in a black dress I hadn't worn since my own mother's funeral, and I felt strangely calm, the calm of a woman who has already cried every tear she has in private. Alone at 2:00 in the morning over the course of 3 long years. It was only after the last guest left, after Aaron had gone back inside to pour himself a drink, that my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't recognize the number and I was exhausted down to my bones, but something told me to pick up. Mrs. Nelson, the woman on the other end, said, her voice measured and professional. My name is Grace Morgan. I was your mother-in-law's attorney. She instructed me very specifically to wait exactly 7 days after her funeral before contacting you. There was a pause and I could hear papers shifting on the other end of the line. There are things you need to know, Rachel. Things Evelyn made sure of long before she got sick. I'll call you again in 7 days. The line went dead before I could ask a single question. The 7 days after Evelyn's funeral passed like a held breath. I didn't mention Grace Morgan's call to Aaron. I told myself I was waiting for her to call back before I said anything. But if I'm honest, some instinct in me, the same one that had been quietly cataloging every small betrayal for months, told me to keep it to myself a little longer. On the 7th day, I finally worked up the courage to tell Aaron I wanted to go back to teaching. I'd started thinking about it the moment Evelyn passed, some small flicker of my old self stirring back to life for the first time in 3 years. I brought it up over dinner tentatively, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. I told him Maple Hill Elementary had an opening for the fall semester, that my old principal had actually reached out when she heard about Evelyn, that I thought it might be good for both of us to have some normally again. Aaron set down his fork very deliberately. He looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd suggested something faintly ridiculous. Teaching, he repeated like the word itself tasted bad. He said I'd been out of the classroom for 3 years, that education had moved on without me, that I'd be lucky if they let me grade papers, let alone run a room full of 8-year-olds. He said it with a small, condescending laugh that I'd heard more times over the years than I wanted to admit, a laugh that always made me feel about 2 in tall. I told him I wanted to try anyway. That's when his face changed, and I watched 20 years of carefully maintained politeness drain out of it all at once. You want to try, he said. Rachel, I only needed you to take care of my mother. He said it flatly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. I sat there, fork frozen, halfway to my mouth, waiting for him to soften it, to explain it away, to tell me he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He didn't. He kept going, his voice rising with something that had clearly been building for a long time. He told me he'd tolerated 3 years of a marriage that had stopped meaning anything to him because his mother needed a full-time caretaker, and he couldn't afford a professional one without touching his savings. He told me that was the only reason he hadn't already asked for a divorce. Now she's gone, he said. So are you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare house key, the one I'd given him a copy of years ago in case he ever locked himself out, and set it on the table between us, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he stood, walked to the front door, and opened it. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and rain was already starting to needle down against the porch steps. I remember standing up very slowly. I remember my hands not shaking, which surprised me because everything else in me felt like it had been struck by lightning. I went upstairs, packed a single suitcase with the essentials. I didn't even take half of what was mine, and walked back down past him without a word. He didn't help me, he didn't apologize. He just watched, arms crossed, as I stepped out into the storm with my life reduced to 1 bag and no umbrella. Nobody stopped me on the walk to the motel 3 blocks away, the one with the flickering vacancy sign I'd driven past 100 times without ever really seeing it. Nobody offered a ride. I hadn't told a single friend or family member what had happened, yet, because I genuinely didn't know how to say the words out loud. 20 years and I was walking through a rainstorm with a suitcase like a woman half my age, fleeing a bad first date. I checked into a room that smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there soaked to the bone, staring at a television I never turned on, feeling something strange settle over me. Not devastation exactly, but a kind of grim clarity, like fog finally burning off a landscape you'd been driving through blind. My phone rang once that night. Grace Morgan's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering, and then let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. Whatever she had to tell me, it could wait one more night. I needed to just breathe first. Back at the house, Aaron poured himself a scotch and, according to what I'd learned much later, called Melissa before he'd even finished his first glass. It's done, he told her, his voice loose and satisfied. I'm finally free. He told her he could see them building something real now, something without the weight of a sick old woman and a wife who'd stopped being useful to him. He told her the house was his, the future was his, and nothing was standing in his way anymore. He had no idea, sitting there with his drink and his certainty, exactly how wrong he was. At 8:30 that evening, freshly showered and feeling lighter than he had in years, Aaron pulled his car into the driveway of the home he believed was entirely his. But as his headlights swept across the front of the house, he saw something that made him ease his foot off the brake. 2 black SUVs were already parked at the curb, waiting. For a moment, Aaron sat frozen behind the wheel, his mind scrambling through a list of possibilities. A break-in, a neighbor's emergency, some kind of mistake. He told himself it had nothing to do with him, that whatever this was would sort itself out, and he could go inside and finish his drink in peace. He was wrong about that, too. He stepped out of the car, slowly, gravel crunching under his shoes, rain still falling in a steady drizzle that had softened from the earlier downpour. A man in a dark suit stepped forward from beside the first SUV, polite but immovable, and asked him to wait a moment. Aaron's confusion tightened into irritation. The particular irritation of a man used to being the one who gave instructions, not received them. "This is my house," he said. "Who exactly are you people?" That's when Grace Morgan stepped out of the second vehicle, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm. Her expression calm in the specific way of someone who has done this exact thing many times before and feels no need to rush it. She introduced herself and explained that she had been Evelyn's attorney for the past several years. She was there to officially carry out the terms of Evelyn's estate. Aaron's irritation briefly shifted into uneasiness, though he quickly covered it with a scoff. He insisted he already knew the terms of his mother's estate. He had seen the will years earlier, and according to him, the house had always been meant to be his. Grace calmly opened the folder and explained that the will Aaron remembered had been replaced 2 years earlier by a revocable living trust. Evelyn had created it quietly, with full legal capacity, long before her Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where her competency could ever be questioned. Under the terms of that trust, the house had never belonged to Aaron. It had remained entirely in Evelyn's name until her death, after which ownership would pass to the person who had served as her full-time primary caregiver until the very end. Aaron let out a short, disbelieving laugh. He called it ridiculous and insisted no court would ever uphold such an arrangement. He argued that his mother would never have done something like this to her own son. Without showing the slightest emotion, Grace turned another page and read the relevant clause aloud in a calm, precise voice. The wording was clear and left no room for misunderstanding. The caregiver named in the trust was Rachel Ann Nelson. When Grace told me this story later over coffee in her office, I wish I could say I felt victorious watching my husband's certainty collapse. But what I actually felt was something much quieter and heavier. I realized that Evelyn had spent her last truly lucid years secretly building me a lifeboat. She had quietly protected me because she understood, long before I did, exactly what her son was capable of. According to a neighbor who witnessed everything from her window, Aaron's voice echoed through the driveway that evening. She later admitted she had watched the entire scene with her hand covering her mouth. Aaron shouted that the whole thing was insane. He promised to challenge the trust in court, insisting no legal document was going to take away the home he had grown up in. Grace remained perfectly composed. She explained that contesting a properly executed trust, prepared by independent legal counsel and supported by medical evaluations confirming Evelyn's mental competency at the time of signing, would be an extremely difficult and very expensive legal battle. Then she handed him an official notice. He had 48 hours to vacate the property. The following morning, at Grace's request, I returned to the house. I was still wearing yesterday's clothes because I had packed only enough for one night away. Aaron stood in the front hallway, surrounded by half-packed boxes. His face showed a mixture of anger and something even deeper, something that looked a lot like fear. The moment he saw me, he turned toward me. "You planned this," he said, his voice shaking as he struggled to stay in control. "You and my mother went behind my back for years. You knew about this the whole time." I stood quietly in the doorway of the house I had cleaned, repaired, and mourned in for years. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the need to apologize or smooth things over the way I had done throughout our marriage. I looked directly at him. Rainwater dripped from the hem of my coat onto the hardwood floor that Evelyn had always asked me to mop every Sunday. "No," I replied softly. "Your mother did." He had no response. He simply stood there among his half-packed boxes in a house that was no longer his, staring at the wife he had once told to leave with nothing. Only to discover that she was the one thing his mother had made sure he could never take away. Moving back into the house didn't feel the way I had imagined. I expected to feel victorious, as though I had reclaimed something that belonged to me. Instead, every room carried memories of the life I was trying to leave behind. The kitchen still held the faint scent of Evelyn's chamomile tea. The hallway still had the small scuff marks left by her walker after 3 years of slow, determined walks back and forth. Whenever I passed her old bedroom, I still caught myself expecting to hear her call my name. I gave myself 2 weeks to sit with those memories before thinking about the future. Then I called Maple Hill Elementary. My former principal, Diane, a warm but practical woman who had sent flowers after Evelyn's funeral, didn't hesitate for a second. She told me the 3rd grade position was still available. Half the staff had asked about me over the years, and she would be delighted to welcome me back whenever I was ready. I cried during that phone call, not from sadness but from relief. It was the kind of tears that come when a new door opens instead of another one closing. 3 weeks later, I stood once again in front of a classroom full of 8-year-olds. Chalk dust covered my sleeve, and for the first time in years, something inside my chest finally relaxed. It was through the school that I met Daniel Brooks. His daughter, Emma, was one of my students, a bright, thoughtful girl who reminded me of the children I used to joke would one day become architects. As it turned out, her father actually was an architect. Daniel had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, and there was something about him I recognized immediately, a quiet exhaustion that comes from carrying an entire family on your own. He attended every parent-teacher conference with genuine curiosity instead of obligation. He remembered the names of the other children in Emma's reading group. He sincerely thanked me for the little things, for staying after school to help Emma with spelling, and for noticing when she seemed unusually quiet after a difficult week. Our friendship grew slowly, just as the strongest and most genuine relationships often do. He came by one Saturday to fix a section of fence that had come loose in a storm, something he'd offered to do after overhearing mention it at pickup. He didn't make it a big gesture. He just showed up with a toolbox, fixed the fence, and left before I could even properly thank him. A few weeks later, he replaced a porch light that had been out since before Evelyn died. When I caught a bad cold in early winter, he left a pot of soup on my doorstep with a note that just said, "Feel better." No reply needed. I remember standing in my kitchen with that note in my hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not romance, not yet. Just the strange, quiet relief of being looked after by someone who expected nothing in return. Aaron, in the meantime, had moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place with beige walls and a view of a parking lot. I heard about it secondhand through mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist passing along the details. He'd tried at first to maintain the same image he'd always cultivated, successful, unbothered, moving on just fine. But Melissa, it turned out, had never been particularly interested in Aaron himself. She'd been interested in the version of him that came with a paid-off house and an executive salary. The moment word got out that he'd lost the house, that his mother's estate had bypassed him entirely, Melissa's interest evaporated with startling speed. She stopped returning his texts. She started arriving late to meetings he was in and leaving early. Within 2 months, she transferred to a different branch of the company entirely. And Aaron was left alone in his beige apartment with nothing to show for the version of freedom he'd been so eager to celebrate that rainy night with his scotch. I heard through the same grapevine that he'd started drinking more, that he'd grown quieter at work, less of the sharp, confident salesman his colleagues used to describe. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't satisfaction, not exactly. It was more like the particular sadness you feel watching someone finally reckon alone and too late with a truth they'd spent years avoiding. Meanwhile, my life kept quietly rebuilding itself. I started sleeping through the night again. I started laughing at things without immediately feeling guilty for enjoying myself. Daniel and I began having coffee after school pickups. Nothing formal, just 2 tired adults comparing notes on their strange, upended lives. He never pushed. He never made me feel like I owed him anything for his kindness. which after 20 years of a marriage built on obligation, felt like its own kind of miracle. It was late on a Tuesday evening, almost 5 months after that rainy night on the porch, when my phone rang, and Aaron's name appeared on the screen for the first time since the driveway confrontation. I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly out of surprise. His voice when I picked up sounded smaller than I remembered it, stripped of its usual polish. "Rachel," he said, "can we talk?" I agreed to meet him, mostly out of curiosity and partly because some old war-known part of me still felt like I owed 20 years the courtesy of a final conversation. We met at a small diner halfway between our two lives, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never stopped refilling. Aaron looked different, thinner, a little grayer at the temples, dressed less carefully than I'd ever seen him. He'd always been a man who ironed his own shirts before important conversations. That night his collar was slightly wrinkled, and something about that small detail told me more than anything he was about to say. He started with an apology, the kind that comes out in a rush after months of rehearsing it alone in an empty apartment. He said he'd been under enormous pressure those last few years, work, his mother's illness, money, worries he'd never told me about. He said grief had made him cruel in ways he didn't recognize until it was too late to take back. He reached across the table at one point like he might take my hand, then seemed to think better of it and pulled back. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. Didn't soften my expression to make it easier for him, didn't offer him the reassurance I might have given freely 20 years ago. When he was done, I asked him one question, the only one that actually mattered to me anymore. "When exactly did you stop loving me?" "Loving," he opened his mouth, then closed it again. He stared down at his coffee like the answer might be written in the steam rising off it. He tried a few times to start a sentence and abandoned each one halfway through. Watching him struggle, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept before. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving me at some identifiable point, some moment I could pin down and grieve properly. It was that he'd never really known how, not in the way that mattered, not in the daily unglamorous, unrewarded way love actually requires. He'd loved the idea of a devoted wife the way he loved his job title, as something that reflected well on him. Not as something that required him to show up for another person when it wasn't convenient. I didn't say any of that out loud. I didn't need to anymore. I just felt the last thread of obligation I'd been carrying without even realizing it quietly go slack. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, right on schedule, because we'd planned to meet for a movie that same evening and he'd offered to swing by the diner first, so I wouldn't have to sit alone in the parking lot afterward. He didn't come inside or make a scene. He simply waited by his car in the lot, visible through the diner's front window, patient in the particular way that had become so familiar to me over the past several months. Aaron saw him. I watched something shift across his face, not jealousy exactly, something closer to a slow, sinking recognition. For the first time in his life, Aaron understood what it felt like to be the one standing outside waiting for someone who had already moved on without him. He asked me quietly now, almost pleading if there was any chance we could try again, start over. He said he'd changed, that losing everything had taught him things he should have learned decades ago. I believed in that moment that he might even mean it, but meaning something and having earned the right to ask for it are two very different things, and I'd spent enough of my life confusing the two. I already spent 20 years proving my love, I told him, gathering my coat from the back of the booth. I'm not spending another 20 proving my value. I said it without anger, without theater, the way you state something you've simply come to know as fact. He didn't argue. I think some part of him had expected exactly that answer, even if he'd hoped for a different one. I left him there in the booth, staring at his cooling coffee, and walked out to where Daniel was waiting. He didn't ask what had happened. He just opened the car door for me the way he always did and let the silence between us be comfortable instead of demanding an explanation. 3 days later, my phone rang again, but this time it was Grace Morgan, not Aaron. Her voice had a gentler quality than I'd heard from her before, less businesslike. She told me there was one more piece of Evelyn's affairs that needed to be settled. A sealed letter Evelyn had left specifically for me with instructions that it only be delivered once the estate matters were fully resolved. And enough time had passed for me to read it without the weight of legal chaos clouding my mind. She wanted you to read it when you were ready, Grace said. I think that time might be now. I read Evelyn's letter alone. Sitting at the kitchen table where I'd fed her 1,000 small spoonfuls of soup over 3 long years, in the late afternoon light of a Sunday that felt in hindsight like it had been chosen for me on purpose. Grace had dropped off the envelope that morning, sealed with Evelyn's careful, old-fashioned handwriting across the front, just my name, nothing else. I sat with it unopened for almost an hour before I finally worked up the courage to break the seal. Her handwriting inside was shakier than the writing on the envelope, clear evidence of a hand slowly losing its strength to the disease. Even as she wrote it, she admitted she had known long before her diagnosis became severe exactly what kind of man her son had grown into. She confessed that watching him treat me the way he did over the years had broken something inside her. It was something she never fully shared with anyone, not even her lawyer, not even in the quiet pages of her own journal. She wrote that she had started planning the trust almost 2 years before she passed away, during one of her last periods of complete clarity. She did it because she knew Aaron would eventually reveal his true nature once he no longer needed me. She couldn't stop it from happening, but she could make sure that when it did, I wouldn't be left with nothing. Near the bottom of the page, her handwriting became smaller and more careful, as if she wanted every word to be perfect. "You stopped being my daughter-in-law the day you became my daughter." I read that sentence 4 times before it truly sank in. When it finally did, I put the letter down and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to for years, not the quiet, controlled tears I had held back during Evelyn's illness. Not the numb silence of the night Aaron threw me out. This was different. It was the kind of release that comes from finally being seen, fully and completely, by someone who had witnessed everything and understood exactly what it had cost me. The months that followed brought something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for most of my adult life: peace. I returned to teaching, and my classroom once again filled with the wonderful little chaos I had missed: spelling tests, scraped knees, and the joy of watching a struggling reader finish their very first sentence. Daniel and I continued building our relationship slowly and honestly. There was no pressure, no rushing, and neither of us expected the other to fill an empty space in our lives. Emma eventually started calling me by my first name instead of Miss Rachel, and in its own quiet way, it felt like being welcomed into a family. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in my backyard, one of the simplest yet most perfect places. We had just finished cleaning up after a small dinner with Emma. There was no fancy restaurant, no dramatic speech, and no crowd recording the moment for social media. He knelt beside the garden Evelyn had always loved watching from her window and opened a small box. Inside was a modest ring that had belonged to his late wife. Later, he told me it was Emma's idea. She had said her mother would have wanted someone kind to wear it, and she believed I was the kindest person she knew. I said yes before he had even finished asking. I only saw Aaron one more time after that. Several months later, Daniel and I were working in the garden on a quiet Saturday afternoon, laughing about something so small I've already forgotten it, when a car slowed down in front of the house. It was Aaron. The car looked older, a little worn down, much like the man sitting behind the wheel. He never got out, he never waved. He simply sat there for a long moment, watching me laugh in a garden that had once been his, standing beside a man who looked at me in a way Aaron never had. Then, without a word, he drove away. I don't know what was going through his mind, and honestly, I've stopped trying to figure it out. What he truly lost that day wasn't the house, it wasn't even the marriage. It was his final chance to understand what it feels like to be loved by someone who stays, fully and without conditions, long after it stops being convenient. I still think about Evelyn often, especially during quiet moments in the garden. Whenever I hear an old song she loved or watch Emma reading with the same quiet focus Evelyn once had, I remember her hand holding mine as she told me never to let anyone else decide my worth. Now I understand she wasn't simply comforting an exhausted caregiver. She was passing on a lesson she had learned too late in her own life, hoping I would never have to learn it the same way. For 20 years, I believed love meant sacrifice, giving until there was nothing left, and calling that devotion. Now I know better. Love means being valued while you're still here, not being appreciated only after you're gone. I'd love to hear what this story means to you and where you're watching from today. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have many more unforgettable stories waiting to be shared, so be sure to subscribe and never miss the next one. Let's continue this journey together.